troop numbers in the area. Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us now live from Sydney. Good to have you with us once again, Antony. So first of all, let's start with this news about deploying more troops to Khan Yunis. What does that suggest to you, particularly combat engineers as well?
Israel knows it's on a really strict timeline. And what I mean by that is that it's clear that international pressure, although often it's not clear where that's coming from, parts of the EU, the US behind the scenes are really going to be saying at some point soon, I mean, not, of course, soon enough, that this has to shift to a different phase, that Israel, I think, is trying to run down the clock, meaning that they're going to try to do whatever they can in the time that they have with all these huge amounts of troops in Gaza. But of course, there's a real disconnect between what Netanyahu is telling the Israeli public and what's actually happening. And the mission from the beginning has always been destroy Hamas entirely, militarily, politically. And it's increasingly clear that that's not likely to happen. They may well kill some of the leaders. They may well obliterate Gaza as a entity. But Hamas will survive in some form, either within Gaza or certainly across the Arab and Muslim world. So I think this idea of putting more troops into Gaza, I think, shows that there's an increasing desire to kill indiscriminately. As we've seen, the death toll is at least probably 23, 24,000. We don't really even know, which in itself is a shameful fact. So I think it's running down the clock.
So the increasing troops not going to help achieve strategic military objectives?
Well, I guess it depends how it's sold. I mean, as I said, from day one, October 7, Netanyahu and many of his allies have said that the only way that this can be solved is to completely destroy Hamas and to so-called liberate Gaza for essentially Israel. And I think it's conceivable still that militarily much of Hamas may be dismantled within Gaza. I think that's possible. But at what cost? And I note in the last 24 hours, I've been hearing from my sources and also what I've been reading, that there is still constant pressure from Netanyahu on EU leaders and Biden to pressure Egypt to allow in huge numbers of Palestinians into the Sinai, which thus far Egypt has not done. So there is still a real plan, I think, amongst many in the Israeli government that the so-called end goal here is ethnic cleansing. And at the moment, at least, it seems like Egypt will not accept, I'm sure, the huge amount of bribe that has been offered by Israel and the US to do so.
You mentioned the window and a sort of a deadline for the Israeli operations. When we look at what a Dutch court recently ruled, finding that, quote, it seems evident that there are violations of humanitarian law, does that make the clock ticking sound even louder, if I can use the analogy there?
Well, it does. And just for viewers, just the context for that. So essentially there were litigants in the Netherlands who are pushing the government there to stop sending parts essentially to Israel for its F-35 fighter jets, which are flying and dropping bombs over Gaza as we speak. And the court found in favour of the state, so those sales can continue. However, as you rightly say, Sammy, the caveat was very clear, which essentially acknowledged that almost certainly the Netherlands, through its actions by supporting Israel, and Israel's committing war crimes in Gaza. And it's interesting because many other countries, including my country, Australia and others, are sending spare parts, so-called spare parts, to Israel to fight in its current war. They've been doing that for years. So essentially you have a situation where huge numbers of officials in many countries are potentially complicit in war crimes in years to come, if and when investigations happen. So the clock is ticking in that way, but still, ultimately, the only force that can really stop this is the US. And thus far, at least, Biden's refusing to tell Israel to stop.
All right. Always good to talk to you. Thanks so much, Antony Loewenstein.
Thank you so much.
Much of Gaza